This time last year, we were just opening up to the prospects of a period of uncertainty as the COVID-19 coronavirus began its spread across the globe. Now, we look back at the carnage that the lockdowns have brought about with record contractions in GDP. Central banks have been back in supporting the markets. Some of the best performing areas have been life sciences. This is the pharmaceutical and biotech companies that make up this exciting area of opportunity. They have, in some cases, seen a doubling, trebling, and some seeing their share prices rise more than tenfold on expectations that their research may develop into the silver bullet needed to bring COVID to heel. Is this possible? Or should we reorganize and recognize that we have to live with COVID for years to come? Where is the key money going? And how should we now view the life sciences sector? Welcome to today's IG Trading the Markets podcast. I'm Jeremy Naylor. I'm talking today to someone who is a medically trained doctor, but who has also built major healthcare franchises for leading UK brokers and investment banks, raising over £2 billion for the sector. Well, recently, his focus has been on COVID-19 and the need for continued investment to provide second and third generation vaccines to tackle future mutations beyond long COVID. Dr. Navid Malik, Head of Life Science Research at the Life Sciences Division. It's a pleasure to have you on board today to discuss your research and the implications on the investment arena. Navid, I want to begin, first of all, if I can, with the science. COVID has been the all-consuming factor for everyone over the last year. Our understanding of this, the coronavirus, has moved on in leaps and bounds. But at the same time, the virus has been changing. For us in the trading and investment community, it is throwing up all sorts of opportunities. I want to begin at the beginning, first of all, and ask you as to whether or not the virus itself is like any other virus, or can we apply previous viral knowledge, or is this a new area and should we be approaching it as such?
Yes, thank you, Jeremy. So the coronavirus family, of which COVID-19 is a member, have actually been circulating for probably hundreds of years. There are around 4 coronaviruses which have been constituents of the common cold since the 1960s. 2 emerged in the 60s, and 2 novel coronaviruses emerged in the preceding years after SARS was seen in 2003. So we're familiar with this family of virus, and it has, comprising that 30% of all common colds, this family of viruses are ones we're familiar with. We only have been warned and given warning shots from these novel emerging viruses such as SARS in 2003, MERS in 2012, and then obviously COVID-19 in 2020 because of the increased transmission. But we are familiar with this family of viruses.
A year in, where are we in the long-term picture globally?
Unusually, because of the higher transmission rate of COVID-19 and the fact that it has this asymptomatic aspect where the virus does not present with symptoms in many patients or individuals who are infected with the virus, we've been caught off guard, I would suspect. When we had the emergence of SARS back in 2003, it was quite lethal. It had a case fatality rate of around 9%, which is much higher than COVID-19. But it was easily contained because individuals who had the virus were able to be quarantined relatively quickly, and track and trace worked very efficiently. The problem with COVID-19 is that we were caught off guard through the whole of 2020. We've struggled to contain the virus. Countries such as China, Hong Kong, and the Far East more generally have been successful, but they had the experience of SARS 20 years ago. We never had that experience. And so we've found it really challenging to contain. And of course, we've really been challenged by the fact that these new variants have been continuously emerging throughout that period of time that we've been dealing with the virus.
And of course, also in the West, we have a more open society, of course, don't we, where we value our freedoms. And of course, going about our daily enjoyment of life as much as anything else is something which it's very difficult for us to lose. As of course, in China, it's a little bit easier for the authorities to keep control. But let's follow up on this point about the mutations, the Kent version, the South African, Brazilian. What do we know about these? What are they doing? And how does this interact with this new idea of recombinations?
Yes, that's a great point, Jeremy. So these particular variants of concern, so the Kent, the South African, and the Brazilian, and excuse me for using these terminologies, and the acronyms are rather cumbersome with different numbers. But the actual variants that we're talking about, the reason why they're a concern is because there are a lot of mutations occurring in a particular region of the spike protein. The spike protein is the sort of the hook that the virus uses to latch onto a cell to infect you as an individual. And these mutations in the spike protein, where they're concentrated in larger number, can cause alterations in the morphology of the spike protein or its degree of openness, because it's in a closed position normally, it happens to open up as it binds. And the mutations are causing all kinds of changes in the physical and chemical nature of the spike protein, which allows it to not only bind more aggressively to a cell, but also increase the level of concentration of the virus in your upper airways as an infected individual. And that, of course, leads to higher transmission in any case. In the early months of the pandemic, these particular variants were seen as a troubling but not necessarily increasing lethality. But that isn't the case anymore. We're seeing a lot more increases in the case fatality rate or the level of lethality in each individual risk in terms of who's been infected. And the concentration of these mutations, unfortunately, leads to the increased risk that this particular set of variants have a higher resistance to natural immunity, even if you've been infected previously. And more troublesome, in my view, is the increased risk that the vaccines become less effective, not completely ineffective, but less effective against these particular variants.
What about the idea of recombinations? How is that different from a mutation?
Yeah, so this is again another point that's a great one to have raised. When we look at the perception of what's going on with COVID-19, we're constantly hearing this issue around mutations that are evolving in the virus as it increases its transmission through the population. The problem is that mutations happen almost in sort of small step changes. So each individual mutation takes time. We know the coronavirus family don't mutate as fast as something like flu or HIV, for example. And the coronavirus family in its own right has the ability to recombine with other coronaviruses. So within this COVID-19 landscape, there are literally thousands of variants that have been emerging over the last 15 months or so. But the specific recombination of variants of concern, so these are the ones that we are most worried about, if those variants start to recombine with each other, and by that I mean a person is infected with two different variants, both variants are present in the cell together, and as the virus replicates within the cell, it is not only able to increase any mutation that it wants to, but by definition, the components of each individual variant can cross over and merge, and the genetic information can be exchanged. Now, when that happens, the problem you face is that rather than tracking an individual mutation, you now have wholesale changes. And that's really worrying, because many of us don't realize that COVID-19 actually had undergone something like 70 recombination events before it was able to get into humans. And so we've now seen in California in the last 2 weeks, the first defined recombination event. And that means that we could see a dramatic change in the way this virus is behaving and its ability to infect and cause death.
We know from experience, of course, over the last year that some people have a far more serious reaction to the COVID infection than others. And you talk about some people being asymptomatic, some people, of course, hospitalized. And tragically, of course, we know a number of people have lost their lives as a result of this. Is the virus discriminatory, or is a pattern developing of who's vulnerable? And the big question is, of course, is it these mutations and recombinations? Is it making us all far more vulnerable?
So when you look at the ability of the virus to seek out the individuals where it will cause the most damage, so to speak, or the most harm, it was initially seen in the older population and those with underlying health conditions. What this virus does is it seeks out vulnerability. Patients who have a risk of heart attack or stroke, patients or individuals who have a high blood pressure, therefore have an increased risk of that occurring. And the virus also seeks out those patients who are diabetic. And it has been particularly worrying that those individuals with these underlying health conditions have been at a higher propensity of not only serious illness, but also death. One of the challenges we face is that in the early days, we were shielding the more vulnerable members of our society, and we were able to some extent, control the virus through the summer of last year. However, these mutations, and many of which, the South African, for example, and the Brazilian variant, were emerging even back in October last year, these particular variants are now throwing a sort of spanner in the works. And what's going on is that the individuals who were previously infected, in fact, are showing increased risk of reinfection. And the infections are creeping down the age range. So we're now seeing, particularly if you look at the Amazonian region in Brazil, we're now seeing people who are in their teens or mid-20s and 30s and 40s being hospitalized. And there's a particular region in the Brazilian Amazonian sector, which had something like, back in April, they had already seen a first surge. And they had, by November, 76% of that population in that Amazonian region who had been infected. So by definition, they had achieved herd immunity, which is what we're always talking about. The problem is that within that same group of individuals, the new variants that have emerged in Brazil are reinfecting them. So either the virus has found a way to evade the immune system, or the neutralizing antibodies that you should be producing after initial infection are no longer effective. And both those scenarios are particularly troubling and worrisome.
Yeah, I want to get on to the pharmaceutical response to all this in just a minute, which hopefully will shed some positive light on all this. So let me ask, first of all, though, if we can, while we're staying on the science, what about long COVID? What does that mean?
So long COVID is basically a set of lingering, and I use that sort of term very loosely, lingering clinical symptoms that potentially are not allowing individuals who've been infected to recover. When you look at the individuals who have infection, even if it's asymptomatic or very mild in nature, a large number of those individuals have neurological issues. So they cannot have a normal functioning sense of taste and smell. And you have to ask yourself a question, why is that? And the reason why that's occurring is because normally we see the virus is infecting a cell, and there's a particular receptor called ACE2, which is present literally throughout the body. And the virus is very good at infecting cells with that receptor. However, what transpired late into the second half of last year was that there is a co-receptor, as you can call it, another receptor, which the virus, when it's infecting an individual in the nasal area, can infect that co-receptor, can go into that co-receptor. Sadly, that co-receptor is present on your olfactory nerve, your nerve tract leading to your brain from the nose. And so the loss of sense of taste and smell is because the virus is getting into your nerve tract. Now, once it's inside your nerve tract, it's acting a little bit like a virus that's hiding. And your immune system doesn't go into your brain. It's immune privileged. It doesn't go into nerve tracts. The antibodies can't get there. So the virus could be hiding in those regions. And much like other viruses, could reemerge when your immune system is under pressure or there's an opportune moment. And the virus is going to continue to replicate. So long COVID is really, by definition, I think, the sort of symptomatic process by which individuals who are having this sort of, brain fog, or they're having other longer term symptoms, is simply because the virus is continuing to attack them in those regions of the body. And that's another area that we've got to deal with going forward.
One final question about the science. Is there an evolutionary takeaway from all this? Are we becoming, as you said, herd immunity to some degree, giving some sort of protection for some period? In the very long term, do you think that ultimately we're going to adapt and be able to share our lives with COVID in a more equal way?
I think that if you look at every virus and how each virus has evolved, ultimately, when it infects a new species, it will, over a longer period of time, become less dangerous, less lethal. Because ultimately, all the virus wants to do is basically spread. It wants to infect as many individuals as it can. Because we had no underlying immunity to this virus, it was a novel coronavirus, we really, unfortunately, found out the hard way that this virus could cause a lot of damage, and it has clearly done that. Over time, and I think we would be looking at this in terms of 10 to 20 years in terms of time frame, this virus will circulate, and there'll be herd immunity, and it will really cause very, very mild disease. The issue we have today is that herd immunity takes time to build up. We've got to think about herd immunity not at a UK level, but at a global level. And we've got to deal with these new variants that can get round potentially the neutralizing antibodies from someone who's already had an infection and recovered, or from individuals who've been vaccinated. So we're going to have to continue to develop new iterations of both vaccines and, I think more importantly, therapeutics in order to deal with this virus. For the time being, I suspect for the coming years, we will live carefully alongside the virus. I don't think it's something that when we were in 2020 thinking 2021 would be a gateway to opening up completely. Yes, we are on top of this in the UK because of our vaccination program being so successful. But ultimately, we have to think of this as the virus went through a series of mutations in the first wave in 2020 when the immune systems of individuals who were infected was fighting back. We're now facing a prospect of the second battle that we're going to have against the virus, which is basically where we're vaccinating a large part of the global population and the virus will fight back. This virus is not going to sort of sit down and fall over and succumb to the fact that we're vaccinating the population. What the virus will do is it will find ways to find our weaknesses, to figure out ways of mutating around the immune response, whether that's an antibody or T-cell response. So we have to have faith in our ability to beat this virus, but we also must be very cautious that this is going to be a longer battle than we recognize.
Let's move on to the pharmaceutical industry response, because there has been a very, very fast response. In fact, some people have been very critical of this, and this, I think, is given rise to some that believe that they shouldn't be having the vaccine. How has this been possible? How have we seen these drugs come on the platform for experimentation so quickly and then come into the market so quickly, when previously 5-10 years have been a drug's lifetime before it even gets onto the shelves?
That's a great point. And I think the reason why we were able to develop a vaccine so quickly was it wasn't that we didn't have the toolkit. I mean, if you go back to swine flu and the pandemic back in 2009, we didn't have the type of technologies in use that we have today. Now, it's accepted that the technologies we're relying on today, such as mRNA vaccines and adenoviral vectors, were not approved in any way. I mean, there was no mRNA vaccine to speak of up until COVID arrived. However, the pharmaceutical industry really was able to move quite quickly once these small biotech companies and academic institutions, which kind of saw this as an opportunity to draw up a Marshall Plan to really figure out what was going on, took the first step. So I have to say that it's very laudable that these academic researchers and biotech companies literally put everything down, stopped everything that they were doing, and a large number of them put in place a strategy to figure out, how they could make these fast development timelines enacted to produce a vaccine that could be tested in humans. And I think once we recognized that we could get these early viral constructs, vaccines in place that were able to mimic and emulate the spike protein, which is the part of the virus that is used for infecting the cell, then we were able to go into the clinical trials programs quickly. And governments obviously did their part in a big way. But what was very interesting was that the pharmaceutical industry also came in and kind of picked up the momentum, and jointly with the biotech sector, not in all cases, some biotech companies went alone going forward, but jointly with the biotech sector, everyone got together and developed this clinical program. Most important thing I think that we should recognize is that the regulators also pulled out all the stops to ensure that we were able to develop a vaccine in rapid fashion. So what you normally see is this kind of 10-year timeframe, as you described, which would include the phase 1, the phase 2, the phase 3. So going from safety to working out whether this product works, and then going to testing in larger numbers of people, individuals. That whole process was truncated heavily. So in effect, from literally an idea on a piece of paper of how to create a vaccine to approval was about a 9-month process, which was utterly spectacular.
Yeah, just from a medical point of view, should we be focusing on drugs to try and cure, or to try and prevent, I should say, or to try and mitigate the effects? Do you think that would be a better way of doing it?
I think we've got to do both, because we can't get rid of this virus. This virus has such an efficient way of transmitting itself. And bearing in mind that, when you look at the vaccine efficacy trials, the trials that have produced the best results have really been on the older variants, the Wuhan variant and the USA variant that are circulating, and the ones in Europe. However, when you look at regional clinical trial data, for example, trials that have been conducted in South Africa or Brazil, the data is quite strikingly different and the efficacy rates aren't as high. So I think that the difficulty we have is that we can't stop the development of vaccines, and we need to go to the second and third generation vaccine level to develop vaccines that are a lot more smarter in order to really drive a stronger, more comprehensive immune response, and also to give us that longevity of being able to deal with the virus, even if it changes over time. But we also need to develop therapeutics. I mean, we've done really well, particularly in the UK with the recovery trial that was started in 2020. We're developing a panel of therapeutics, particularly steroids and some of these more novel antibodies, in order to deal with the clinical consequences of the disease, to stop people from dying and going into intensive care. But the challenge we have is that the virus, much like other viruses, such as hepatitis B, for example, will elicit resistance not only to vaccines ultimately, but also to therapeutics. So we've got to keep pushing hard on the innovation lever and continue to develop novel therapies that deal with all of the consequences, not only of the acute phase of infection, where we're trying to keep you as a patient from dying, but also to dampen down and mitigate the longer term damage effects. I mean, bearing in mind people who go into hospital, into ICU, end up, a third of them, on dialysis. And then again, coming back to long COVID, there are really quite worrying long-term neurological symptoms that individuals are experiencing, which may not resolve on their own. So we need to do a full kind of strategy of harnessing all of our knowledge about this virus, which has only been, just over a year old in real terms, and understanding what we need to do to deal with these clinical issues.
Just one final question about this. If a drug is 85% effective, what does that mean? What about the 15%? Do they get COVID no matter what, or is it a mild version, or is it what's the difference between 85 and 15%?
So the individuals who took part in these clinical studies, any level of infection, whether it was mild, moderate, or serious, would have been monitored. And the vaccine showed a terrific efficacy in preventing more serious disease versus individuals who were not vaccinated or given a placebo. For those individuals who had mild disease, most of them would have had very, very few symptoms, if they had symptoms at all. And of course, there is a bucket of individuals who are asymptomatic, of which we don't know really how well these vaccines have been protective. But in the symptomatic patients, those who had symptoms and presented with them, there was 85% efficacy, which basically means that we, compared to the placebo arms of these trials, we were able to see a significant reduction in individuals who would show any effects in terms of the symptoms of disease that were presented. However, that, of course, if you tot up the numbers, that leaves 15% who did show some degree of vulnerability, if you want to call it that, to the virus. And it's that 15% as a number that you have to focus on, and you have to think about whether that number will grow over time. But my concern is that potentially that number will grow, and therefore the high efficacy rates of the virus could recede over time as multiple variants circulate. And I accept the fact that we can clearly develop in rapid order new versions of the vaccines. But the problem we're going to have, I suspect, is that where you have countries where there are multiple circulating variants, and some of them may be slowly burning through the population, we may not even be aware of them, are going to potentially present us in a scenario where you sort of have to figure out which variant you're vaccinating against. Because the bigger challenge we have is that the vaccines are trying to drive a lever in your body, which is a slow effect. Vaccines don't work in an instant. They take time for your immune system to be trained up. And the biggest danger, Jeremy, that I think we face going forward is that if we keep continuing to revaccinate individuals, we've got to be mindful of the fact that the immune system may not be able to discern between one mutation and another in the spike protein. So we've got to figure out other ways to help individuals who are infected, and particularly those who might succumb to more serious disease.
Interesting. This, of course, is the pharmaceuticals' job, isn't it, to make sure they push the boundaries all the time. Let's move on to take a look at the governmental response. Should governments, do you think, be working more closely together? We saw that rather unsightly spat between the European Union and the UK on the Northern Irish border. There is, of course, different countries are doing things at different speeds because of the medicines agencies have different approval rates and so forth. But do you think that in this particular case, governments ought to be working together in harmony, trying to get this disease out of the way as fast as possible? Or do you think there is a case here that we are doing things at different speeds because that's just how it is?
I would really hope, and I've admired the collaborative efforts between governments, the WHO, for example, included, in trying to understand this disease and fight back against it. However, we've seen vaccine nationalism, as you've alluded to, Jeremy, and I think that one of the challenges is that that's an easy trap to fall into. What we've really got to do is we've got to forge partnerships. I mean, we've got to understand that this virus is not going to disappear, and the virus will do everything it can to increase its transmission and its lethality. It isn't going to just turn itself into something that's innocuous over time. We cannot also allow the weakest link in the chain, if you think about countries, to allow the virus to circulate in a region in the world where it can continue to accumulate mutations, or maybe even in a worst case scenario, we talked about recombination issues. What if this virus recombined with the other coronaviruses that circulate? Or what if it combined with the Middle Eastern coronavirus called MERS, which has a really high case fatality rate? I mean, 36% compared to SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19, which is between 0.25% and 3%, then you're in a situation where the alarm bell should be ringing more strongly. So as a collective, globally, we've got to do a lot more. We've got to sequence much more, not just the UK leading the charge, but all major regions leading the charge. And we have to develop a kind of mentality that we've got to start thinking about how we work together more aggressively. So taking away, the sort of nationalistic elements of any particular strategy that we want to embolden, maybe because we want to satisfy the populations of that country, and think of this as a war that's a kind of war of the worlds. We have to fight back against the virus. And one of those things, just in terms of, what I've been seeing, is that I think there is a real desire in the US and the UK, particularly, I think, driven from some of the participants in the UK, to forge a very strong potential relationship between the UK and US to deal with COVID-19, long COVID. In other words, what the long-term consequences are. Are there biotech companies both in the UK and US that can do more collaborative efforts to understand how we deal with long COVID? Because these particular issues are going to manifest themselves in a much larger way going forward, because long COVID is not something that's going to resolve in weeks or months. It could take years for individuals to recover.
Indeed. Let me ask you, if I can, to put your analyst hat on. Now, I know recently at the Life Sciences Division, you have published a large paper on this. You talk about individual stocks, you talk about trends, you talk about the outlook. I know that under regulations, we're not allowed to do that. We're not allowed to talk about individual stocks. I'm not going to ask you for recommendations, but I think it's really interesting to get your view on the investment landscape, if we can. Previously, there'd been this perception, certainly in this country, some of the smaller stocks, they'd been a bit hit and miss. Let's say you've got to invest across 10, 12, 14 stocks in order to find one that might give you some sort of return to offset the losses in other areas. How is the investment landscape changing? Do you see big pharma dominating, or do you see us more now moving towards these smaller companies that have hit the news over the last year or so with some spectacular rises in share prices for a number of different reasons? How are you viewing the market now as an analyst?
If you're looking at the biotechnology sector, particularly in the UK, I've always felt in the early years, I've been an analyst for 20 years. In the early years, when I came into the city, I was talking to institutions about the biotech sector. They kept saying to me, don't want to invest in biotech because it's, you lose all your money. I don't understand the companies and the drugs and the pathways and the diseases. And more importantly, they kept kind of throwing things like, what about British biotech? They kept saying these biotech companies that have blown up, people have lost a lot of money, institutions that had the capability to do the research lost a lot of money. So why would we invest in biotech? And I think what the biotech sector has shown in the UK is that we had to innovate our way through that. We had to really understand as a biotechnology sector, and I'm talking collectively as part of it because that's how you work as an analyst. We had to figure out what it was about the biotech sector that could be done better. And I think what really helped the sector was the fact that we, in the scientific community, in the medical community, were able to come up with some really interesting and exciting breakthroughs. The Human Genome Project, the sequencing of the human genome back in 2000, was a major landmark. It wasn't going to produce an overnight success in terms of a new range of companies that would develop new drugs so quickly. But there are a number of things that coalesced together. The toolkit, as I call it, of how you understand the ability to diagnose a disease, how you understand a disease itself, and the range of therapeutics. So in the early decades of the pharmaceutical industry and biotech, you would look at small molecules as being, able to treat and cure any disease. But that just became a myth. That wasn't true. And then as we moved into the next stage, biologics, these antibodies and protein drugs became much more successful and more efficacious and had a better safety profile. But we weren't able to turn the dial in, say, diseases like cancer until we really moved into the next revolution in the biotech space, which was basically the evolution of peptides and antibodies around the vaccine approach, cellular therapeutics, stem cells, regenerative medicine. All of these areas moved aggressively forward. And I think the US biotech sector was really a great proxy for us to look at and latch onto. And as these companies delivered clinical success, they started to be acquired. And if you look at the last sort of credit crunch back in 2009, the sector was on its knees. But what the sector did was, as I said, it innovated its way through that. And there was limited capital in order to allow those companies to be successful. But where there were successes, they were proven out to be bucking the trend. And because they were able to do that, a lot of money was starting to circulate and returns were going through the roof in the sector. I think where we are today is that the regulatory landscape has completely changed, in terms of most of the major regulators around the world, particularly the FDA, put in plans back in 2012, for example, where they were redefining the way that drug development occurred. And they were shortening and speeding up the process for areas of poor or unmet medical need so that new drugs could get to market very quickly. And because of that, the biotech sector has enjoyed what I call and describe many times as a renaissance period. We're seeing diseases that we thought we could never conquer and drugs that have never made it to market despite, dozens of failures in those particular disease areas. We're seeing those drugs finally make it. And yes, there is pressure on pricing. Of course, there will be. But, the generics market is now pretty much 90% by volume in most countries, particularly in the US. And the pricing pressures that we were worried about haven't materialized. I think when you look at the fact that companies can deliver such great value for patients and the payers, because they're pretty much controlling a disease or potentially bringing it back to a level of normality, you're in a situation where the biotech sector suddenly starts to look like a flower that's blooming. And that vision of what the biotech sector can do has really started to come into the mainstream. And I think COVID is a great example of that. If you look at what's happened in the biotech space, biotech has been the white knight. Biotech has been our savior. If it wasn't for biotech, I don't think the pharma companies were able to move as fast. And that, for me, has been a singular success story in the last year that you can point to show that the biotech sector now is a completely different space to invest into.
What about the perception that 90% of research will fail? That's not going to go away, surely, is it? A lot of research comes out of universities. Much of it is speculative. Every now and again, you do get the one really big opportunity. But there are presumably a lot of the companies that do fall by the wayside, and that will remain, surely, won't it?
Yeah, it's an interesting observation and a debate to be spawned from that. I feel like we've had an evolution in the biotech sector. If you go back 10, 20 years, I think the companies that were going to fail have failed. And those who were left standing survived, not just because they had a balance sheet that could carry them, but because they developed clinical endpoints. They announced data, they hit milestones, and some of them obviously were acquired and some of them made it all the way through to market. But the concept that, the biotech companies aren't going to be successful, I think has to be reappraised, because what the biotech companies are able to do now is they have an arsenal of decades of research that they can look to, scientific and clinical. The database that we have, in the world around different diseases is vast. And we now have the opportunity to access that as a biotech community, for example. They can go to papers and they can go to clinical trials that have failed in the past, and they can learn from those mistakes. So we're almost acting like a sentient sector. The biotech sector is living, it's breathing, it's evolving, and all of that knowledge has been accumulated. And I truly believe that the biotech sector now doesn't have that 90% stigma of, 90% of companies or biotech drugs will fail. I think it's flipping the other way. Maybe not to the level of 90% of companies will be successful, but there's no doubt in my mind that the early failures failed, the early companies failed, and the ones that were resilient have continued to evolve from strength to strength. And also we're seeing, outstanding breakthroughs in some of these disease areas that for decades have held us back. For example, last year, one of the really big biotech companies in the States filed the first antibody drug for Alzheimer's disease, because after dozens and dozens and decades of failures in developing a novel Alzheimer's therapeutic, they showed for the first time ever that they could successfully deliver an antibody that hit a clinical endpoint successfully in their trial passed. I think that that's going to be more common in the smaller cap biotech space, and we'll see the proof of that, because it's not just about share prices returning. As these biotech companies get to market and generate cash flows and become profitable, then you're going to see that technology halo effect. You're going to see the tech bull market that we've been experiencing for probably more than 20 years now. You'll see that seep down into the biotech sector, and we'll see a really strong upward trend in the biotech space. And M&A will help, obviously, as companies get acquired.
How important then is the life sciences sector in our investment future? I mean, we've been talking there about small biotech. We've also referenced the large pharmaceutical companies that we know made up of all sorts of areas. Is the future going to be, do you think, for our investment portfolios, those niche research companies or the big drug businesses? And then again, we've got to dig even further down, of course. There's the production, the research, the development, the drug discovery, the diagnostics. We've got so many areas to look at. As an investment analyst, what do you say to that about the way through the noise to try and get the opportunity?
My kind of modus operandi is really to focus on drugs, devices, or diagnostics where there is a poorly met or unmet medical need. I mean, if you're sort of looking at a company that's developing a generic drug, then yes, if it's successful, it will be there, generate cash flows and revenues, obviously, but it won't be a company that you'll make a terrific return in as an investor. But if you look at those companies that have those sort of niche areas where, in the old days, you might do a trial in a large population. Now you're more focused, you're doing smaller trials, more nimble, and you're getting to data quickly. If you're able to deliver that successfully, then you become a much more investable company. And I sort of firmly believe that the trouble in the UK market has been not just the sort of looking in the back rear view mirror and looking at all the failures and not seeing successes, but actually it's kind of more to do, in my mind, with the fact that we haven't really given the sector the right level of capital investment. I mean, the cost of capital in the US is vastly cheaper than it is in the UK, but we don't have those sophisticated investors. When I talk to institutional investors, whom basically I'm doing all the time, for a long period of time, they were telling me that they couldn't invest in the sector because they couldn't understand it. And I don't mean to be flippant, but my kind of thought process and riposte to that is, well, if you're not investing in a sector that's generating significant returns or supernormal returns, or where you're seeing significant alpha, and you want beta because you want more risk to generate those returns, then why aren't you getting the expertise to look at the sector and to do the investments you need to do in the sector? Because so many of the funds are generalist funds. There are very few specialist funds in the biotech space. Most of the money going into the sector is from generalist investors, and a lot of them claim not to understand the sector, and we've just got to change that model. We have to get the resource. We have to invest more in understanding these companies so that we can make the right investments and the right judgment calls. And you don't sort of have a situation where people are investing into companies and then are surprised, unfortunately, by an event that occurs which they had no idea was coming because they didn't have that view of the landscape. So there is a need for, I think, analysts to communicate better as much as we can within the restrictions, today of how we can disseminate information, who we can talk to. But there is a need for analysts to talk to the investment managers more holistically about the sector and have a kind of an honest discussion about what the benefits and risks are in the sector. It isn't blue sky, and there are downside risks to investing in these companies. But if we can quantify the sort of upside and downside risks, then we have a better chance of success. And actually, some of the fund managers that I speak to often ask me, what's the probability of this occurring, or a drug making it to market, or a regulator approving a drug? And in my mind, they're thinking about the downside quantification of risk versus the upside. And of course, if the upside risks are fairly high, then they do want to take that investment, and they do want to make that investment for their underlying clients.
Do you see M&A picking up in the sector as a result of what we've seen over the last year? I mean, I'm talking not necessarily within each individual subsector, such as biotech, but I'm talking about the diagnostics companies merging with production and research and development, coming together with drug discovery and so forth, across subsector merger environment in which we can now expect companies to get together. Or do you think that we will see this distinct different areas remaining?
So we actually looked at this in our research note. The actual M&A that occurred last year was something in the order of about $120 billion by deal value. And there were 900 issuances. In fact, biotech funds raised about $70 billion. And there were 462 issuances. So biotech companies rather, not funds. And within that landscape, that was a terrific year. And it was actually a record year in many of those parameters. What was surprising was, if you think about it, we just went through a global pandemic, which has literally brought the world to a standstill. And yet the biotech sector was able to deliver more M&A, more clinical inflection points that were successful. FDA approvals, by the way, last year were at the second highest on record, 53 of the new drugs. And by the way, also, only one of those drugs was for COVID, 52 of them for non-COVID. So if you think about it, the FDA were outstanding in their productivity. It's such a difficult situation. But I think that you're right. You've got to drill down into individual niches. And actually, the better returns are going to be made where you are more sort of nuanced and selective about which area of the subsector that you invest into. For many years, the devices and diagnostics space has been seen as I hate to say this expression, but a poor cousin of the biotech space. I don't think that's no longer the case. I think the diagnostics and devices segment of the market has been ignored to a greater extent. And COVID actually showed that the diagnostic space could be revolutionary in its approach to solve the problem of building rapid diagnostics, not just for PCR and sequencing and things like that, but also for point of care diagnostics, these lateral flow tests that have come out, which will get us out of the lockdown, obviously. So if you look at the individual subsectors, there's no doubt that, you need to look at the whole sector, the whole life sciences space. And it's going through a momentous change right now. And these companies are becoming more emboldened to do things that they perhaps were constrained to do previously. And these individual segments as an investment opportunity are rising in numerous number. And it's giving us an opportunity to have, rather than a dearth of ideas, we've got a broad and deep range of ideas to look at.
And finally, talking about the big picture, prior to the big highlighting of the sector of the last year, what was the sort of a good portfolio, a good investment portfolio? How much of that was previously invested in pharmaceutical life science companies? And what do you think is going to be the new way we should be looking at our investment future, bearing in mind it seems certainly as though these companies are going to be playing a far bigger part in our overall future? Do you see that we should now be looking more seriously at having more exposure to these sort of companies in our overall investment portfolio?
It depends on your sort of on the investment fund or the individual's risk appetite. But if you're looking at the pharmaceutical sector, it's always been a defensive sector, a bit like sort of tobacco. You look at this sector and you think you're not going to lose your money. They do very well in the downward years. They throw off dividends, and they've diversified their portfolios. Even if pharma companies have patent cliffs, they've managed to do, through productivity gains and M&A, they've managed to fill those pipelines to a larger extent. However, if you look at the biotech space, I guess one of the challenges is that they don't have the bandwidth, both in terms of management resource and capital to diversify themselves to the same extent as a pharma company would. So I've always thought that, from an investment perspective, you should hold both. You should hold, the blue chip companies in a pharma space, and you should hold biotech to give you that sort of higher level of return through more beta, more risk, but you get that alpha as well over time. And I think that that's really where the sector is going to be positioned going forward. It's going to be like the tech sector, in my opinion. The tech sector, in the early days, you saw a lot of companies. They were risky as well as investments, and they were sort of embryonic in stage. They didn't have revenues, but the tech sector got the backing. They showed the innovation. They showed the breakthroughs, and as a result, transformed the whole sector. Everything that we do today is unrecognizable almost from 10, 15 years ago. And what we're going to see is we're going to see a convergence. I do believe actually that we'll see this big data, this AI, artificial intelligence coming together. So tech companies and biotech companies are going to share more overlap in terms of what they're doing strategy-wise. And that you're seeing already with some of the big tech companies going in more direction of healthcare. So the pharma and biotech space, I think, is going to become perhaps more of a core holding for many funds, and it's going to be continue to drive solid returns. I do think the pharmaceutical companies I said this 10 years ago, that will move more to sort of FMCG, fast moving consumer goods, because they're great at marketing. But the biotech companies, in my opinion, have always filled the void. Whenever a pharma company had a pipeline that was dearth, or they had an attrition from failures, or they were hit by a large generic onslaught after patents expired from their main products, always went to biotech to sort of rescue the day. I think that will continue. So having that mixture of exposure between the two is, in my view, the right way to take the sector. So you're not concentrating. You always have a portfolio of a number of investments that you make, and you're not concentrating that risk in a way that could cause an upset later on.
Look, we've got to leave it there, but thank you so much indeed for your time. It's an absolute pleasure to talk about your work there at the Life Sciences Division. That's Dr. Navid Malik. He's head of Life Sciences Research at the Life Sciences Division, and he's been with us here to talk about the research and the implications for the investment arena. For more videos from us here at IGTV, join us on Twitter at IGTV and subscribe to our YouTube channel.